Hej Aino och varmt välkommen till Tranemo Svenljunga Pride. Hello and welcome to Tranemo Svenljunga Pride. This conversation will be in English and I'm very happy to have you here. I will give you the chance to present yourself and your work with asylum right.
Thank you so much, Stina. And first of all, I have to say thank you for inviting me and thank you for the extremely huge work that you've been doing during this Pride and so many other Prides. It's really amazing. So thank you so much for having me here. My name is Aino. I work as an asylum lawyer at RFSL. I have been working with LGBTIQ plus asylum law for about 9 years, which feels like a long time. And well, basically it means that I both have been working with like individual cases where I represent people in the asylum process in Sweden, but also giving legal advice to people who are in Sweden who might be in the asylum process or who might be undocumented after getting several negative decisions, but also people who contact me from abroad, which has become quite common, who want to flee the countries that they're in because they face persecution because of their sexual orientation or gender identity or gender expression. And like I said, I've been working with this for about 9 years, and my experience as a lawyer, but also of course being part of the movement and RFSL, I found that when I began working with this, I would meet a person and they would come to me and sit in my office, and maybe for 1 or 2 or more hours, they would tell me what had happened. They would say that my parents or my family found out or started to suspect that I'm gay or lesbian, that I'm trans, that I'm bisexual or something, or they caught me having a same-sex relationship or something, that something happened, and that's what forced them to flee. And and obviously some of them managed to maybe hire a smuggler, and they somehow managed to come to Europe and come to Sweden, and they would tell me what happened to them. And I used to sit and listen. And that's after that, we would go to the migration agency and we would sit there for maybe 2.5 hours, 3 hours, and they would say the same story to the migration agency. And after that, they were granted refugee status, because it was obvious to me and the case officer at the migration agency that this is a refugee. They are facing persecution and they are supposed to have refugee status. However, I would say that maybe around 2015, 2016, I myself and other lawyer colleagues started experiencing that it became more and more difficult to be granted refugee status in these cases, where it was so obvious to us lawyers and fellow allies in the community. It was so obvious to us that this is a person who is supposed to get refugee status. This is a person who is supposed to be granted asylum because they risk persecution. But it started to get so difficult. And in my head, I just started thinking that I want to find out why. Is it just me and my colleagues who are specialized in what I would call SOGIESC asylum cases, which is sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics. And I wanted to find out why. So I've spent the last maybe 2 to 3 years writing a research or a report for RFSL, where I actually studied over 2,000 individual decisions and court rulings in SOGIESC asylum cases, just to find out what are the criteria, what do the migration agency and the courts, what do they require to grant someone asylum who is facing persecution because of their sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. And when I studied these many cases, it is actually I assume, biggest research in Sweden so far, because it was over 2,000 individual decisions and court rulings. And what I found was, which is not unique for Sweden, but what I found was that the migration authorities in Sweden, within what we call the credibility assessment, where it is the asylum applicant who needs to make credible to the migration authorities that they either are an LGBTIQ plus person or that they are perceived by people around them to be an LGBTIQ plus person. And what I found was that within this credibility assessment, the migration authorities, for example, they actually require that the applicant has specific experiences and also that they can describe these experiences in a very, very, very detailed way. And to sum it up very, very briefly, these requirements that the migration authorities in Sweden place on the applicant, they are based on very, very Western thoughts and Western definitions about what is sexual orientation, what is gender identity. For example, they actually think that all of us LGBTIQ plus people around the globe, that we have universal experiences of feeling deep inner feelings, that all of us around the world, that we have gone through this deep inner painful journey, that all of us have felt stigma, shame, difference, these very, very negative feelings about ourselves, and that all of us can describe in a very detailed way how we discovered, how we realized our sexual orientation or gender identity, and even gender expression, like the physical appearance. So this is actually a requirement that they place on people who are applying for asylum for these reasons. And they also require, which to me is even more strange, that the more taboo, the more stigmatized LGBTIQ is in a certain country, the more the asylum applicant, has to be able to talk about it. And not only does this make zero sense to me, because you would think that the more taboo, the worse criminal laws and so on, the more difficult it would be for a person when you come from a country where it's the state authorities who are persecuting you because of who you are, the more difficult it would be to then come to a new country, apply for asylum, and then talk about these things in a very, very detailed way. Not only is it strange for me that that's how they're expecting people to talk, but it is actually contrary to Swedish and international law. The Swedish Aliens Act is very clear in stating that when someone comes from, for example, a very homophobic country that may have laws against same-sex relationships, for example, that you could almost assume that that person is probably going to have a very difficult time in talking about who they are, how they have lived, and how they feel, and those things. I'm just going to say something else which I think is important. When I started to read all of these hundreds and hundreds of decisions, negative decisions and court rulings in these cases, I very soon started thinking that who has the right to define the asylum grounds? Whose definition of sexual orientation and gender identity and gender, who has the right to define what we are talking about here? Is it the person who is in need of protection, who is talking about their life and their experience, or is it the Swedish state authorities? And very, very obviously, it is the Swedish state authorities who are implementing and taking the right to define what is sexual orientation. How do we see it? And then they expect and actually require that the applicant talks about themselves in the same language, using the same vocabulary that the state authorities here are using. And that is very, very wrong. Because, like I mentioned, the Swedish state authority, and this isn't happening only in Sweden, it's happening in so many countries, but they take the right before the asylum seeker who is a refugee, who is in need of protection and who is entitled to protection. They actually have the right to get protection. But it is the Swedish authorities' Western definition of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression as something emotional. They see it as a question of identity, whereas I would say not only many asylum seekers, but I would say many of us human beings, we might define our sexuality, sexual orientation, gender identity or gender expression as something that we do, or our physical appearance, or who are we attracted to, which people do we have sex with, and so on. But when the asylum seeker talks about that and says, this is how I see myself because of this and this, they will be given a negative decision because they have the wrong way of identifying themselves. They have the wrong way of like describing themselves. And this is wrong. And it is actually contrary to both Swedish law, the Swedish Migration Agency's own legal guidelines. It's contrary to the UNHCR guidelines, and so on and so on. And this keeps happening, and it is systematical. So you have this asylum system or process where the Swedish migration authorities, they have very, very strict criteria when it comes to how someone is supposed to talk about themselves. And then they are not considering, first of all, that all of us, we are individuals, and we have individual ways of talking, defining ourselves. We come from different cultures, which also obviously has a very big impact on how we talk and everything. It is contrary to Swedish law, to international law, and these are actually, I mean, it's prejudice. And I would say that it's also a lot of racism in this, because you're not considering that people come from other cultures where you might talk differently, or you might not talk at all about deep feelings and emotions, whether you are straight, gay, a cis person or not. I should say something just also before I let Stina in for questions, or any one of you who might have questions. Apart from these, I call them stereotypes because they are stereotype thoughts, prejudice about how all LGBTIQ people are expected to be, which has no bearing on reality. It isn't true, and they are also unlawful, like I've mentioned. There is also a lot of other rejection motivations that are contrary to Swedish and international law. For example, these days, the migration authorities, they actually require that the asylum applicant who is an LGBTIQ person, that they talk about risks. Which risks did they take? This is what the migration agency or the courts will ask. What did you think about risks? How come you kissed a partner of the same sex in your car? Or how come that you flirted with someone? And so on and so on. And the whole point here is that the migration authorities in Sweden and in many other countries seem to think that we LGBTIQ plus people never take risks. And those of us who have taken too big risks, we don't deserve asylum. We don't deserve protection. And as a lawyer, I recognize this from other legal fields. It's very similar to when people within the criminal law system, when people have, for example, been subjected to sexual violence, people have been subjected to, for example, a rape, where the prosecutor, maybe the defense lawyer, maybe even the police asks questions to the person who has been assaulted, who is a victim of sexual violence. They would ask, what were you wearing? How drunk were you? What did you do? Which risks did you take? How did you behave? And then it becomes very, very difficult to even sentence the person who has committed the crime. And I see a similarity here with LGBTIQ plus asylum seekers, where like the blame for the persecution is placed on the person who is seeking asylum and who actually has the right to be granted asylum. When you start asking these questions and you demand, which risk did you take? How did you think about the risk? Why did you take risks in the first place? So there's a lot of like blame and shame being placed on the applicant, which is obviously also unlawful. I also found in my research that the migration authorities, in a very strange way, they require that the asylum seeker should know about Swedish laws about LGBTIQ persons, which rights does one have, and so on. Which, I mean, there is so much to say about it. It is ridiculous. And how is someone who just arrived in Sweden, are they going to start reading up on Swedish laws? When you come from a country where you might face the death penalty, And are you supposed to find out those laws when you live in an asylum camp in the bush and in Swedish when you don't know Swedish? Like, it is just, the whole asylum process is very, very full of these stereotypes, requirements that have no bearing on reality. And I actually even found what I didn't think I'm going to find, which are two things. One is that they still use what we call discretion reasoning. So they can actually tell a person who is applying for asylum that, well, you used to hide that you're homosexual, or you used to hide that you were dressing in like the wrong gender's clothes to a trans person. So you can continue doing that at a return. And this is like, in asylum law, I would call it the biggest no-no. It is so extremely unlawful. It has been unlawful in Sweden for 15 years. That's 1.5 decades. And it has been unlawful in international law for 10 years. That's 1 decade. It is extremely not allowed to tell an asylum seeker that you can hide your sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression to avoid persecution. And still it is happening in Sweden. I've seen this in several cases when it comes to, for example, Kenya. The migration authorities would say, well, you haven't shown us that you're going to be marching on the streets and publicly show and propagate for LGBTQ rights. And that kind of reasoning means that they think that only people who are very, very open and they are going to be shouting on the streets, that it's only that person who risks persecution, which isn't true. And such reasoning assumes that as long as you are deported and you stay in the closet, you hide, you don't go out, you don't have a partner, you don't do anything, then everything is fine. And it is unlawful. It has been unlawful for 1.5 decades in Swedish law. The other thing I thought I will never find today in case law is that they are actually confusing sexual orientation with gender identity and gender expression. So it happens that, for example, a trans girl who might be a minor or might be an adult, but I saw especially one case where she was a minor, that means a child. She used the words trans. She used the words transsexual. I'm a trans girl, I'm a trans woman. And there was massive amount of evidence, medical evidence, where doctors had written, this is the hormone treatment, and this is the other type of treatment, gender affirming treatment that she's getting in the country of origin, but also in Sweden. And despite that, she is being questioned by the migration agency as if she was a homosexual man. And then she gets a negative decision because she didn't make her homosexual orientation credible. And it happens also to trans women. One case was from Iraq, where they actually have the death penalty, where a self-identified trans man who had been saying things like, I feel like I was born in the wrong body, I want to have surgery, and so on and so on. And still he is being questioned as if he is a lesbian woman. And this keeps happening and happening, and over and over and over, these people are being denied asylum because of the migration authorities' wrongful assessment and illegal, unlawful confusion of sexual orientation and gender identity. And even the lawyers in these cases obviously have not reacted because they also lack competence. And I really thought this isn't still happening in Sweden, but it is happening, and people are being sent to countries where there's actually the death penalty. So I don't know, I think time is running, but there is so much to say, and I could go on and on and on. I looked at over 2,000 individual decisions and court rulings, and I found things that are shocking, and they shouldn't be happening in Sweden, they shouldn't be happening anywhere. And again, I can only say that these rejection motivations, they're happening systematically. The criteria that they place on asylum seekers are systematical, and they're happening still today. And people are being, as a result, systematically denied and deported to countries where they do face persecution. And these are countries in, well, Africa, obviously, East Africa, West Africa, also North Africa, in the Middle East, many countries that have imprisonment and even the death penalty. Some of them actually even have methods or tests that they subject people to who are suspected of being LGBTIQ, and those tests they have actually been classified as torture by the UN. And in such cases, the migration authorities could still use discretion reasoning, which is that they assume that the person can continue hiding who they are. So I don't know, I wish I could like end this with something positive, but it's really heartbreaking and upsetting. The only positive thing I can say is that this research was published last year in November, so it's coming to a year in 3 weeks. We from RFSL and also RFSL Youth, we do have a dialogue with the Swedish Migration Agency, and they have promised to get better. But when it comes to the migration courts, I would say that I'm very disappointed. They haven't even replied or given any kind of response to this massive research, which I find is a bit rude, to be honest. Yeah, I think I want to open up for a discussion or questions or thoughts. I realize that this can be quite emotional for people to hear.
And I think it's a baby here.
I can see the baby.
Yeah, and I think we open up for questions, as you said, and please ask questions, and I will repeat them so that Aino can hear them well, and so that it's recorded. Do you have any comments or questions?
Yeah.
Or you can come here.
Okay.
Just...
Yes, I'm called Agaba Rogers. Patrick is my lawyer. I had negative in March, but since then, I don't have any reply from migration. And Patrick told me send a letter to an appeal to migration, but I don't know. But my question is, if like, I'm just asking to know, if I have a partner who is, I don't know, maybe a Swedish, a black one, how is it like we can, when we get married, how is it possible or it's not possible to, as like, I see like a woman to a man, it's possible. But how is it if it's as like, if I get my partner?
If it's possible to get married
Yes.
as a homosexual?
Yes.
It is in Sweden, yes.
It's allowed in Sweden?
Yes.
Very much allowed.
Yes, since 2009, it's allowed. Sorry, what? Yeah, if you're an asylum seeker, if you can get married then.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, so you can.
It can be possible. And I also just want to say that when it comes to like individual advice in your specific situation, I would rather not give you advice just because I don't want to expose your situation to anyone who might be listening now or later. So if you have specific questions, you are very welcome to contact either me directly or also your lawyer, Patrick.
Yeah.
And I can maybe share my email address if Stina cannot do that.
Of course. But
normally I would give out my visit cards, but I'm not there physically. So.
But I think it's as a follow-up to your question, it's also interesting if that can help the case or if it can make any difference, like being married to a man in Sweden. What's your experience around that?
That is a very important question that I usually raise when I give a lecture or talk about the research, that it is so strange and very frustrating that these days we see that someone might be cohabitating, like they might have a partner, they might even be married to someone of the same sex for years. And then the lawyer in the migration court would call them as a witness so that they will come to court and testify, yes, we are married, we know each other for a long time. And then the court will deny the person with the with the motivation that is not relevant for that person, the spouse, the husband or wife or partner, to come and testify. They would say it is not relevant, yet they are questioning the person's credibility and sexual orientation. So that is the situation that we see today. So to be honest, I don't have any trust in the authorities. But then, of course, I have to say that it depends very, very much on the lawyer that you have, how engaged they are and how good they are in these cases, how experienced they are in these cases. But because that is so, so important. There are lawyers out there who don't even meet the client before the first asylum interview, which almost always has disastrous consequences because you don't know which questions you're going to be asked. You don't know the requirements that the migration agency have, what they actually expect you to talk about these days, not what you actually experienced or what you actually risk, but what you are expected to talk about, the inner process and which feelings and all of that. So, yeah.
Thank you, Aino. Do we have any more questions or comments? You can come.
My question is like I have a friend who is now here at the university, but we were together in Uganda, and he has like 3 degrees now. He's doing a master, but he's being sponsored by some LGBT group from UK. So he wants to remain here because he's seeking for protection. Now, what procedures can he take?
When it comes to applying for asylum, and Uganda is obviously one of the countries where someone who is LGBTIQ plus or someone who is perceived to be LGBTIQ plus, there is no question within the migration authorities that someone would risk persecution. So the thing would be the credibility assessment. But like I said, if you have a good lawyer who can prepare you for the interview, that person would have a very, very, very good chance of being granted asylum. And when it comes to applying for asylum, someone can do that at any point. If you have a visa or a residence permit because of work or studies, you can always apply for asylum. But like I tell many people who ask me about like that your friend's situation, I really understand and have so much respect for that someone might not want to apply for asylum. That would be the last option that someone has. Of course, that is extremely understandable. But if your friend wants, they are welcome to contact me, and I can give more individual advice to them.
He lives in North, and he told me, because when he talked to me, I advised him to first go to the migration and report his case, since it's an urgent issue and back home he has problems. And he decided to contact his people in UK, and they suggested for him that Sweden would be the safest country for him.
Not actually the safest, but because of a residence permit here, it would be Sweden that is responsible for the asylum application. So it could be a situation where if someone went to another country, they would send the person back to Sweden since they have some kind of residence. But I don't want to go too much into detail because I feel like I really want to think about someone's integrity and not maybe expose them if it's very much individually about the case. But please give my contact information to the person, or if you want to contact me by email or telephone, then I would be happy to give you advice.
Give him your contact.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think we have time for one more question if you have, or comments. Then I just want to thank you so much for coming, Aino, and even more for the work you do. It's amazing. I
have to say right back at you, because you are a very, very, very fantastic just activist, and thank you so much for everything that you do, all the prides you arrange, all the people that you take care of. Really, I have seen it firsthand with my clients, and like I can't thank you enough. It really means everything to them.
Thank you, and the same. And I'm touched. Thank you. But I think also that we need to take care of each other. That's what we do the best within LGBTQI movement, and we need to keep on working against racism, against a system that is illegal.
Yes.
So, and I want to be hopeful, like in the end, but I'm not right now. But we have election next year. We have a lot of things to do before that, and we need to be more activists, and we have a group of them and a future one in the room here.
That's fantastic.
My issue is because Patrick is my lawyer and he's already handling my case.
Yeah, because we will not talk about the individual cases now because it's being recorded.
I just want to also say that like we, like me and Stina and so many of us, like we, how can I say, we kompletterar varandra. Like we have different roles, but all of us within the community, I mean, we're also activists or so for a reason. I mean, there are so many asylum stories that I can recognize and that I've heard so many times, and it's just, I really, there are so many of us who professionally are fighting our asses off, to be brutally honest. And for me, it is the legal advice and legal representation within RFSL. And for Stina, like we work together. So when I have a person who is applying for asylum, I will be dealing with the legal part of it and helping the person through the legal process with everything I have day and night. And Stina will be doing almost all of the rest. And it is so important. I really just want to give you a big thank you, because it means really the world to the persons. So we work together to strengthen.
We will continue to do that.
Exactly.
We will continue. Once again, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
And next time we want you here as a person. So
I would love that. I would love that.
Yeah.
And please give out my email and telephone number.
For sure. So yeah, big thank you. Take care.
Thank you. You too.
We will...
Have a nice evening, all of you, and have a happy Pride.
Thank you.
Thank you.